happens is if this species is endangered, then we don't want to release the information about the location of that to everyone. So a journal editor will also be checking to see if this is an endangered species, then we need to make sure that in the methods we've removed the information about the location. Because what we don't want is to encourage other people to go there and start taking these samples. And then you have biosafety and biosecurity. And this is really for the types of research like in the biotech industry, in the engineering industry, in the physics industry, where a researcher might be doing some work that's actually very important, but it can lead to some misuse. So it can lead to the development of biological warfare. It can lead to the development of nuclear bombs, for example. So when the content is like that, so you as a researcher, you don't have those kind of intentions, that's fine, you're doing your research. But what we need to make sure is that the information in the paper can't be used for purposes that can actually be harmful. And if there is information like that, then we need to advise the authors on what element of that information needs to be removed. And then it comes to social sciences and humanities. Now, all the principles about working with humans are the same in social sciences and humanities, but one of the differences is the study designs can be different. And I mentioned at the beginning that research in humans has to be done with their consent. You can't do research on someone in secret. But in some humanities fields, the nature of the research means that they might have to do the research without informing the participant, because it will change the behavior of the participant. And that's called use of deception or covert research. Generally, that's not allowed, but if the ethics committee allows it, then there has to be very careful conditions under which you can do that. So if anyone's research is based on not informing someone that they're part of the research, you have to be very, very careful and seek the advice of your ethics committee, if you have one. Because if you do this kind of research and don't seek that kind of advice, you may be breaking some laws, and therefore you may get into serious trouble later on. And then internet-based research and social media data. So again, we all use the internet, we're all used to filling out surveys and doing things like that. But if you're a researcher conducting research in that way, you have to be sure that whoever you're asking to respond knows why you're doing the survey and how you're going to store the data. So you need to make sure there are terms and conditions attached to the survey. And then things like preservation of cultural monuments and remains. If you're doing research in these kind of areas, have to make sure that the way you're doing the research is not damaging any property. And then research on other cultures and limits on cultural recognitions. So many people within the humanities field will be working with different cultures and respecting that, absolutely. But if there are conditions that question the human rights of someone, then as humanities researchers, we need to be mindful of that and not encourage that. There is a problem as well within research, it's called ethics dumping. And that's where some researchers, not just in the humanities field, also in the medical field, will intentionally collaborate with researchers from another country where their laws about ethical research is not very high. And so by collaborating with them, they start to do the type of research that is unethical because they're not conducting it in their own country. So that's something we call ethics dumping, and we have to be very careful about. I'll skip past this because this is mainly about medicine, so I'll skip past this. I will mention this one because this is about if you're publishing any kind of research that can potentially identify someone, then they have to know that you're publishing it, because you're releasing their details. In medicine, this can be a case report, but in humanities, this could also be something like interviews. So you've done interviews with people and you've collected their details. And if your intention is to publish your research in such a way that people will be able to identify them, then you have to get consent to publish. This cannot be waived by an ethics committee. This is a journal requirement. And basically, you're telling them, I'm going to use the research I've done on you and publish it in this journal, and your details are going to be included. If you're ever in that position, you need to get written consent from them. You can't read all of that, but this is the one we have at Taylor and Francis. You don't have to use the journal-specific one. You might have an institutional one. I'll skip past that. Victoria mentioned about open science and data. Now, because I mentioned at the beginning about this problem with articles being published that actually contain fake data or unreliable data, there's been an increase of pressure from researchers to make it mandatory for some authors to release their raw data. So it's not enough to just submit your article with your figures and tables anymore. Many journals now are asking for the raw data that you have based your figures and data upon. And this is so that they can verify what you have done. Some journals will ask the reviewer to look at it. Some journals ask you to submit it as part of your entire submission. So that ties into what Victoria was saying, that you have to pay attention to the instructions for authors, because if you're submitting to a journal that requires this, then you need to prepare your data. So that was all about research ethics. Now we're talking about publication ethics. Now what is it and who's responsible for it? There's not one person or one organization that's responsible. It's actually all of us together. It's researchers, publishers, institutions, together by consensus say that we need to take these steps in order to ensure that what we are publishing can be trusted. That's basically what it is. And this is guided by different organizations. So one of the first organizations which was launched in 1978 was the ICMJE. And they mainly were looking at things like consistency of formatting. But the main organization I want to point out is COPE. So this is the Committee of Publication Ethics. And how COPE formed was just by a small group of journal editors back about more than 20 years ago. And this is because different journal editors were having similar problems. They were getting papers that were plagiarized. They were getting papers where there was an argument about the authorship, or papers where something was wrong with the figures. And they didn't know what to do, like how to handle it. So a small group got together at a conference, just round a table to say, okay, we need some guidelines. And actually the demand for those guidelines has grown so much that more than 20 years later, all of the scholarly, reputable journals, we need to be a member of COPE. If we're not a member of COPE, then we actually can't prove that we are following best practices editorially, and that they become very, very important. Why is it important? I've mentioned about fake data and things like that. I'll give you some examples now. So, is anyone here familiar with Andrew Wakefield? He's a doctor from the UK. He published a paper almost 20 years ago, actually, claiming that through his research that there was a link between vaccination, so that's the measles, mumps and rubella vaccination, and autism. And he published this paper in a very famous medical journal, saying, what I'm seeing is if children are vaccinated with this vaccine, they might be developing autism as a result. And of course it caused great panic because all parents want to keep their children safe and vaccinate them. So people became confused and stopped vaccinating their children. But what happened after an investigation, it was found that his paper was based on fake data. He made that interpretation because it was going to be exciting. And it went through the journal peer review system, but an investigation after it was published found evidence that the data was fake. But look at the cost of that. It has actually harmed people because people stopped vaccinating their children. And to this day, some people will suspect and not vaccinate their children. Then there is this example. So this was a research group in Japan that were working on stem cells. And they published a breakthrough paper. It was absolutely breakthrough. And again, published in one of the most famous journals. It was published in Nature. And because they were showing something so exciting in their field, they got lots of interest and were interviewing at news media, that kind of thing. But other researchers within the stem cell field wanted to build upon the work they were showing. So other laboratories around the world were trying to reproduce this so that they could continue with this work. And nobody could reproduce this work, nobody. So then people started to complain to the journal and say, we want to see the data. We want to see because we have suspicions that actually something is wrong here. And because then the journal started to ask questions to the research group, particularly the postdoc who was the first paper, she eventually admitted that she faked the data, she made it up. She didn't realize the paper would get so much attention. Her reason was, she said, she felt pressured by her university because she's a postdoc, she has to produce good work, she has to publish in a good journal, and out of desperation, she made up the data, she pretended it was real, and then got published. And in Japan, Japan is a country like India in a sense where they take great pride in their work, and a damage to reputation is very, very serious. What's very sad about this is the postdoc, of course she left research and she can't work as a researcher again, but her supervisor, who was the leader of the group, who didn't know she faked the data, he actually committed suicide after this. It had such a big effect. And so this is one of the reasons why we have to be so careful, because publishing fake work not only harms people, but it harms careers, it harms lives. This was a phenomenon that we came across in about 2014, where we discovered that, so what happens, some authors will not submit the work directly. They go through an agency, because the agency helps them to write the paper because of language issues. And there was some agencies, this was discovered from China, there's lots of agencies that say, okay, submit your work, we will help you to write the paper, we'll help you to select the journal, that's fine. But they were also saying, we promise you that you will be accepted in the journal. And what was happening, they were taking the papers and they were submitting on behalf of the author, and some journals will ask for recommended peer reviewers. So they were filling in the recommended peer reviewer details that were fake. So they were making up people's names, making up email addresses, then they would receive the invitation to review, and then they would say, oh, this is a great paper, accept. And so this got discovered. This is when I was at another publisher, Biomed Central, so we discovered this trend there, and then spoke to all of the other publishers and said, check your data, we think something is going on. And there was a big investigation, and then it was found that these agencies were, to get money from the authors, were promising them successful publication. No one can promise that. Even a journal editor can't promise that, because it needs to go through peer review. So this was their business model. They were faking reviewer details, providing positive reviewer comments, and the papers were getting accepted. And so after that was discovered, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of papers were retracted. So that led to, obviously, a big impact on the scholarly record, but also a lot of the authors, even though they didn't do this deliberately, they lost their positions in their institutions. They were fired from their institutions. So it harmed their career, even though they technically didn't do anything wrong. This is another problem we're seeing, which is authorship for sale. And this is partly because there is a pressure to publish, and we know that researchers have to publish. So what's been happening is that there are, again, some agencies that work with some author groups. The author submits to a journal. The journal is almost ready to accept, and then the author goes to other researchers in the field and says, I'll add your name to my paper if you give me like $3,000 or $5,000. And so some people are doing that. They go, okay, I don't have time to do my research, but I'm being pressured to do my research. Okay, here you go, here's your $5,000, add my name on your paper. And so we know this is a problem. This is why we're very strict about authorship, because I'll explain a little bit later why we're strict about authorship. But this is an issue that we're seeing as well, so we have to put processes in place to make sure this can't happen on journals we're publishing. And then there's the issue of citation manipulation. So this is a problem where either the editor or the peer reviewer is kind of forcing the author to cite their own work. So they say, oh, actually, I think you should cite these papers of mine. And the authors want to get published, so they add the references in, even though it's not actually relevant. Like Victoria said, references have to be relevant to the work. The other problem is authors are citing their own work too much. So we absolutely expect researchers will cite their previous work. Of course you will, because you're building on your own work. But there was a study that was published recently showing the average rate of self-citation is about 12% for most researchers, but they found a group of 250 researchers that were citing their own work 50% of the time. So why that's a problem is because it's not the paper they're publishing is not giving a broader view of the scholarly work. They're only talking about their own paper, not about their work in balance of what else is shown outside. So that's also something we look at, especially if it's a non-research article. So if it's like a review article, we don't want the author to only be talking about their opinion. They have to be talking about it in context of the literature. I'll skip past that. And then this was, so this is a very famous case in social psychology. So I can't pronounce his name, Dietrich Stapel, I think that's how you pronounce it. He was a very prominent social psychologist, very prominent, published lots of papers, exciting work, all in social psychology, but after a while it was also found he was making up the data, he faked it. At first he denied it, but after a while with investigation he admitted, yes, he faked it. Why? Because he was disappointed in his results. He thought he would get better results from his research. He wasn't getting what he wanted, and he started to make up his data. And because it was in social psychology, it was a little bit easier, in a way, to make it up. So he's also lost his position, he's damaged his reputation, and all of his papers have been retracted. So what is misconduct? So I've been talking about deliberate actions, someone trying to deliberately deceive, that's classed as misconduct, but we do know honest mistakes also happen. But let's stay on misconduct for a while. So there is the authorship problem, obviously. There is the fabrication problem and plagiarism problem, and other types of unethical research like peer review manipulation, or not disclosing your competing interests. So how common is misconduct? I've just shown you some famous cases. They're only the most biggest cases that we hear about, but actually misconduct is quite common. So there was a paper published a long time ago, about 10 years ago now, that actually looked at different surveys that were sent to different researchers to answer anonymously. And all these surveys asked questions like, do you commit misconduct knowingly? Or do you see your colleagues commit misconduct? So I'll just show you the numbers, like 2% admitted, yes, we knowingly commit misconduct. 72% reported witnessing this in a colleague. So we know sometimes researchers are deliberately committing misconduct. And so we as publishers of scholarly journals have to be very, very careful that we're catching this, because we don't want to publish anything that is fake or stolen or plagiarized. So these are the common issues we see. So to start with, authorship. Now, authorship is a big problem, to be honest. It can vary with different disciplines, but on the whole, sometimes we have authorship for sale, like I just said, or ghost authorship. So ghost authorship is where someone has done